Hey guys, so today is going to be our first video in our series on the acts or the parts of worship to kind of build up momentum into Sunday when we finally get to be back together and worship together. And today we're going to look at a really cool story. It involves worship, it involves preaching, and it involves a guy dying. But it's a happy ending. So let's go ahead and read from Acts chapter 20, verses 7 through 12. Let's go ahead and read. On the first day of the week, when they were gathered together to break bread, Paul talked with them, intending to depart on the next day, and he prolonged his speech until midnight. There were many lamps in the upper room where we were gathered, and a young man named Eutychus, sitting at the window, sank into a deep sleep as Paul talked still longer. And being overcome by sleep, he fell down from the third story and was taken up dead. But Paul went down and bent over him, and taking him in his arms said, "Do not be alarmed, for his life is in him." And when Paul had gone up and had broken bread and eaten, he conversed with them a long while until daybreak, and so departed. And they took the youth away alive, and were not a little comforted. Okay, so this is an interesting story, and let's just go ahead and talk about it real quick. Paul is preaching, and he's talking to these people for a really long time. He's preaching, and he preaches until about midnight. David, you are not allowed to preach until midnight. This is not something that I'm not giving you permission here by reading the story. But Paul preaches until midnight, and apparently people are okay with it. They're not leaving, they're staying, and they're listening to God's word. But this one young man who maybe he was working all day, who knows why he was tired, but he fell asleep. And when he did, it made him fall out the window, and he fell, and he actually died. It says that he was taken up dead. And Paul goes down, and he leans over him, and he picks him up in his arms, and he says, "Don't worry, his life is still in him." And it looks like that he was miraculously brought back to life by Paul. And it's a really cool story, and Paul stays there, and Paul goes back up, and he conversed with them even longer until daybreak. That's like until the sun came up, and then he departed. And they took the youth away alive, and were not a little comforted. They were greatly comforted, not a little comforted. And so this was a very positive story, very good, cool thing that happened. But what I want to focus in on is at the very beginning. We're talking about today the parts of worship, and we're going to talk today specifically about preaching, about listening to God's word. On the first day of the week, when we had gathered together to break bread. So Sunday, they're together, they're going to break bread with one another like we do, take the Lord's Supper. And Paul starts to talk to them, and he is preaching. And it's there's a couple things that are really cool here. The preacher, number one, doesn't seem to have any time limit. I joked earlier about David going too long, but this Paul does not seem to have any time limit. The people seem to be more than willing to listen to however long he goes. And so we have to ask ourselves, why is that? And maybe the answer partly is because this is Paul. It's an apostle. He wrote a lot, if not most, of the New Testament. But I think another part of it may be that these people cared about the gospel. They cared about God's word and what was being talked about. If you have something that you care about, you can talk about it all day long. When I talk about football, I love watching football of the Falcons, and I listen to, a daily podcast on the Falcons. It's a short little clip, but I listen to it every day. I could talk about fantasy football or football for quite an impressive amount of time. Same thing for some of my more nerdy things like, board games and things. I could talk about certain things that I'm really into for a really long amount of time, and I could listen to someone talk about those things for a really long amount of time. And yet for some reason, when we talk about worship, we're going to put that preacher on a very strict time limit. And if he goes 1 minute over, we're upset. Seems like the people here, when they were gathered, because it was new, maybe because it was really actually changing their lives, they didn't care about a time limit. They didn't care about how long Paul was preaching. They wanted to hear God's word. And so leading up to this Sunday, when we finally get to be together, I'm looking forward to seeing all you guys. But don't just look forward to seeing everyone. Don't just look forward to being around people. Look forward to spending time in God's word together. Look forward to listening to David bring us a message together and have a mutual experience with the other people around you and listening and studying God's word together as a family. Can't wait for Sunday. we'll see you then. I'm continuing to pray for you guys. Hope you're continuing to pray for me, and we'll see you Sunday.